Namaste, everyone. I'm Dilafruz Williams, professor at Portland State University. I'm chair of the Research Symposium, and my co-chair is Kathryn Stevenson, who has been an absolutely fabulous colleague and partner. Thank you, Kathryn. I was born and raised in Mumbai, India, and in keeping with my cultural traditions and the theme of the NAAAE conference, the power of connection, and in keeping with our topic for this plenary to center culture in environmental education, I would like by starting with the gift of the herb that I absolutely cherish, rosemary. Her oils help us open our lungs and as a metaphor, open our hearts and our minds. With this plenary, with our honored guest, Megan Bang, we hope to embrace new learnings and open our minds. Next, I also want to call on seeds. These are bean seeds, all from my garden. There are so many cultural stories about seeds too, all over the globe. As we come together, and especially during this plenary, my hope is that many seeds of abundance, of life, of renewal will be planted today, creating memories that I hope will sustain us. Next. Well, these 2 days, we've had so many lively and stimulating interactions. I hope you're making new friends and meeting new colleagues. I know that ever since I started at the Research Symposium, I have maintained my friendships with a lot of you. Next. Thanks to our organizers, support staff, volunteers, and sponsors. A very special thank you to Judy Browse, Executive Director of NAAAE. And now we have with us Jason Morris, Senior Program Officer at the Pisces Foundation. He has been a generous and staunch supporter of NAAAE. Jason, we are so happy that you can join us today. Please share a few words with us.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Or good afternoon to many of you. It's morning here where I'm zooming in from. As Dilafruz mentioned, my name is Jason Morris, and I lead the environmental education program at the Pisces Foundation. I'm zooming into you here from Ohlone territory and Berkeley, California. And it's really an honor to be a part of this session and these 2 days. And the Pisces Foundation shares with all of you a vision for a world where people and nature thrive together. And one of the ways that and it's just been awesome to participate yesterday and to see all the energy and enthusiasm that is pumping through the screen, whether it's research around critical current issues related to climate change education or the role of the outdoors in people's lives, which is probably at its peak in terms of public excitement and acceptance all throughout the world, in part, of course, due to the pandemic. But those benefits that people can accrue from spending time outdoors is really powerful, and it's great to see research on that. And we also have, these great strands on evaluation, and evaluation in particular designed to improve program design and delivery, which is so critically important. And how and why we do evaluation really matters. And there's a team here that's going to launch a new portal on the NAAAE website called EEVal. And it's culturally responsive tools and metrics and tips for evaluation. And we're really excited to see what comes about that and how all of you get to use and engage with it with the spirit of, making what everybody does stronger and more effective. And so it's just an honor to be here. We've got a terrific keynote coming up in a few minutes. And thank all of you so much for your support, and to our co-chairs and to Judy, the 50th anniversary of the NAAAE conference, and a rather big number for the Research Symposium too. It's really cool to be here, and I'm just missing the opportunity to rub elbows with all of you around the posters and and in the conference rooms themselves. So I hope all of you will come next year to Tucson, and we can do it in person. And thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason, for being here and for always supporting us. Appreciate your words. Now, just some housekeeping. If you have questions for our plenary speaker or comments along the way, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. Judy Browse and I will moderate for our honored guest during the webinar and at the close. We'll also be recording this and we'll be posting all the recordings on FeedLoop. Now, Megan Bang, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Megan Bang. Megan Bang, of Ojibwe and Italian descent, is a professor of the learning sciences and psychology at Northwestern University and is a senior vice president at the Spencer Foundation. Megan received her doctorate in learning sciences from Northwestern University and a bachelor's degree in political science from Williams College. The title of her talk is Cultivating Just, Sustainable, and Culturally Thriving Futures Now, Research Beyond Coloniality and Capitalism. Dr. Megan studies the dynamics of culture, learning, and development. She focuses on reasoning and decision-making about complex socio-ecological systems in ways that intersect with culture, power, and historicity. Central to this work are dimensions of identity, equity, and community engagement. She conducts research in both schools and in formal settings across the life course. I met Megan several years ago when she was proposing an NSF project entitled Learning in Places. She had invited me to serve on the advisory board. Since then, I have followed her writing and wisdom. I admire her tenacity and commitment to ask tough questions, especially about research. But she's invitational as she pulls you into the conversation and dialogue, even as she challenges many of our taken for granted assumptions. Dr. Bang has co-authored with Douglas Medin a book published by the MIT Press in 2014, entitled Who is Asking?, with a subtitle, Native Science, Western Science, and Science. The book focuses on who's asking the scientific questions, because the questions asked and the answers sought reflect the cultural values and orientations of the questioner. Megan utilizes community-based participatory action and decolonizing methodologies as she feels they are fundamentally necessary for transformative work. Next. At present, Dr. Bang serves on the Board of Science Education at the National Academy of Sciences. She was recently elected to membership in the prestigious National Education Academy, which advances high-quality research to improve education policy and practice. With that, Megan, I turn it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am going to start by introducing myself a little bit too. So, bonjour, and I am coming to you from my original territories that most people know as Chicago. And I have this practice of always making sure I give, even in digital talks, images of the places that I am in. So these are the shores of Lake Michigan, right next to, right close to my house. So thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm sort of excited about it. One of the fun things about invitations like this is that it invites me to take liberties of particular kinds to try to give new sorts of talks, and invites me to try to continually synthesize and re-articulate some of the things that I think I'm learning from across my research. And so today, I really want to take up what I think Dilafruz's invitation to me was to think about what is our responsibility as scholars, as researchers, as environmental educators, given the times that we live in. And in my work, I am very convinced that we need forms of science education, and I would argue very expansively. I use that word to mean environmental education, place-based education, inquiry. There's all kinds of ways. So I'm using that as a little bit of a sloppy indicator of lots of forms of education that help to reshape human relationships with the natural world. And I really think it requires an expansion of what we think of as core to this endeavor. And so in my talk today, I'm going to give you some pretty broad perspectives and conceptual landscape that I kind of dwell in to do this work, what I call nature-culture relations and how I think about it. And then I'm going to try to dive into a project, Learning in Places, that Dilafruz mentioned as a way to show how I'm trying to actually do it. And I like to give talks this way because I think it's our job. I think the discourses of pragmatics often foreclose imagining what really could happen. And so for me as a scholar, I take up this job of thinking deeply and expansively and then trying to make it happen in the world in different kinds of ways and learning what we need to do. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to focus on three kind of core dimensions that I think are related to my argument here around how models of education have to dwell in what we call power and historicity, how I think that we need to drive inquiry and education through what I call should we questions or ethical questions of purpose and of being, and that we need a lot of work and help in developing ways to engage in ethical deliberation and decision-making in communal contexts, whether those are classrooms or in communities. And for me, I just want to say to everyone that is here is I actually think that environmental and outdoor and place-based education has a potentially transformative role in human communities in the 21st century. But I think it requires us to dwell in these areas and to think quite differently than we have historically in these fields, which means also taking up that in many ways, environmental and outdoor education has been marginalized itself in relationship to many school subjects. But I think we need to hold what that means and what that looks like from places of grace and actually leadership a bit differently than I sometimes see. So I return to, I'm going to get there, and I hope that part of what I do today is invite everyone who sees themselves as a researcher or engaged in research to do some of your own wonderings about what is your real responsibility given the times that we live in. And for me to start, I would just say that you need to know that none of what I say here is my own. In fact, the complexity of the work that I do is that I've been in deep partnerships over decades now with different communities exploring these ideas. And so I just want to be clear, nothing that I say today is singularly authored. And instead, I have a relational and ethical responsibility to share our stories, which I sometimes get pushed to do in different kinds of ways. So just to say that, these ideas have been developing, I have been learning from others, and we have been learning together for a long time about this. So what has been core to my work, whether I'm designing learning environments or doing cognitive experiments, is really trying to understand what I call nature-culture relations. And that is, how is the construal of relationships between the natural world, or more than human world, and human worlds actually foundational? And I have made sort of over the course of my work, really thought about 5 kind of assertions that are important to know. So one, I argue that nature-culture relations organize all human activity, that our fundamental understandings of these relationships shape our knowledge systems and our values, that they have evolved and been shaped by power and historicity over human evolution and evolution more broadly, that these relations are foundational to different aspects of human development and cognition, and that they essentially are configuring learning environments everywhere. And this graph is just a really quick way to do this. So what I've been doing is studying what is the difference between what we call an apart of model, which is on the left, where humans are, apart from models, where humans are seen as special and distinct from the rest of the natural world and our ecologies, and models where humans are a part of. And it's the simplest way to kind of see this. And I've been up to that for a long time in different ways. What is really important to recognize is that the US is our education systems have been largely predicated on apart from models. In fact, the history of sort of many industrialized nations has been continually to create human communities that are apart from the natural world. And there's been all kinds of ramifications of that. But largely what is important to understand is that learning in childhood has become an indoor endeavor that was put in motion during the Enlightenment, but it's been under development for a while. It's important to recognize that the average American child spends nearly no time in unstructured outdoor time and much more and more time in front of a screen like we are. That things like our representational ecosystems, from our books to our media to our diagrams to the things that surround us, our cultural tools, are deeply embedded with apart from models. So it lives in our environments even when we may not mean it. And that correlated with that has been a significant decline in broad scale human knowledge about plant and animal life in the 20th century. The average person knew way more about the natural world 50 or 60 years ago than the average person does now, okay? Part of why this is important is that these apart from models are associated with anthropocentric reasoning and unsustainable decision-making. And so when I think about these things, I'm thinking about the systemic transformations that need to happen so that we have a collective capacity as human communities to do and be differently in the world. So what I've been up to is reimagining, so what would it mean for us to have, instead of a lab-based model of science education dominant in US systems, to have a field-based or an outdoor-based, right? We can talk about all the different versions of this. But right now, lab-based sciences dominate K-12 science education. And they even dominate informal education largely. And we made a choice about that. Back in the 60s and 70s. And there's a question for us to make a new choice again about what are the configurations of our model of science education that we need. And so I've been up to that. I've been up to trying to imagine that. I have been doing that specifically in Indigenous communities for a long time, in part, I'll say more about this, because the extraction of children from our lands and waters is the pastime of the United States in order to engage in Indigenous genocide. And so for me, I think a lot about how extraction of our children, whether it was through boarding school eras or through taking us from our lands and waters as the center of our learning environments to buildings, has been in motion for our communities for a long time. And what does it look like to regenerate? But I also think that part of the challenges we see in achieving things like complex systems reasoning is in part due to the impoverished learning environments inside buildings that we have. So for me, field-based science education expands our opportunities to engage learners in outdoor places that help hold the complexity, that are connected to their lives, to their family and community contexts and paradigms. And for us, there's always been this question that learning is always connected to your roles, relations, and responsibilities. When we first started doing work with Indigenous youth around climate change about 20 years ago, we would learn about it, and then we would say, so what should we do? And over that time, I've been really recognizing that simple question of asking kids to also ponder what should we do is actually not routine in learning environments. In fact, it's deeply embedded in a move to say that experts or children aren't yet capable of imagining both action and futures. From all ages. And for me, we've really been after, so what does it mean to motivate and understand the dynamics of identity and learning and well-being with why it is that asking ethical questions is part of childhood, it's part of being a human being, but we've done very little about that in actually our models of education for a long time. And I would argue it's linked to why it is that we end up with a kind of science evidential averse kind of citizenry, because we're not practiced at mobilizing imperfect evidence towards complex problem solving or issues. The other thing that I want to note is there is increasing research to recognize that time in nature, or a lack of time in nature, is linked to human health. The decline in human health over the last 60 or 70 years, whether it's mental health or physical health, is increasingly being demonstrated by scholarship. And so for me, there's a deep question about that we're actually potentially causing other kinds of harm by having children indoors as much as they are. There's really interesting work about the differences in microbial makeup and gut biology connected to mental health. So my point is that while I'm not going to talk about all of these things, I wanted to demonstrate that the kinds of things that I'm asking and wondering about as connected have many, many kind of rippled ramifications. And I invite people to continue to think about and ponder those things. For the rest of my talk today, though, is that I really want to talk about why place and where we learn is so critical. And for me, I really draw on Greg Gahete and Oscar Coagli's work that argued for a long time that the reason Indigenous knowledge systems were quite different than Western is because they originated. Our origins are from our places, and that places produce and teach particular ways of thinking about and being in the world. And so they're always operating. They're not extractable. And so for me, there's a question about how do we go from forms of human life that were deeply connected to places to this kind of different form. How is it possible? And I don't mean that in a I don't need someone to actually explain. I know the history of how we've gotten here. But how is it that our thinking enabled this to think that this was all good? And so for me, there is this really interesting work that different scholars, Indigenous scholars, as well as psychologists, evolutionary psychologists, as well as folks like Sylvia Winter, who have been tracing how over the last couple hundred years, there has been a transformation of what we call organizing human thought around kin relation to organizing human life and activity through institutions and knowledge systems based in human supremacy, and I would argue white human supremacy, and forms of human entitled extraction, where we turn life into resource for human use. And the consequences of that are really significant. Oftentimes when we approach answers to this, we don't recognize that what we actually have to do, in my mind, is also think about how is it that we change human thought differently again. Because sometimes we think we can change the impacts of institutions and knowledge systems based in these things through policies alone. And I don't think that's going to get us there. I don't think it has gotten us there yet. For me, it's important for everyone to understand that colonial conquest has made this possible. And that these issues are global. They're not US specific, they are global. And they have led to different kinds of consequences, but often ones that we don't also see as huge possibilities. And the biggest one for me is Indigenous erasure. And I show this slide wherever I can. Most people do not understand that Indigenous peoples still have, or we are responsible for 80% of the world's biodiversity, still. And that a quarter of all land is Indigenous hands. So when we talk about the kinds of environmental challenges we face, if we don't have a view of Indigenous peoples and our territories, it means we think forward in a way that creates our continued erasure, right? When we talk about things like climate change, 95% of the World Wildlife Fund's top 200 climate change hotspots are in Indigenous territories. I'm not sure the last time you saw that at the beginning of any climate change story, but there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the immediacy of action on climate change is continually moved down decades, because those of us on the front lines and are being currently harmed, climate change isn't something coming, it's something already unfolding, is in Indigenous territories. So the good news, I would argue, and I would argue, and I think it's important that we grapple with these long histories of how we've gotten here, is that I see really promising kind of shifting conceptual, societal, legal, economic, and scientific paradigms that are beginning. I don't know that everyone would quite so directly say beyond human supremacy or are comfortable with calling human supremacy a form of white supremacy. But I do think there is good movement across even Western knowledge systems that are beginning to try to understand a kind of ethical complex socio-ecological systems, whether it's new work in economics or it's understanding that a theory of evolution actually was theorized from a place of competition and conflict rather than cooperation, or the idea that trees could have legal standing in personhood. These things are actually in motion. And for educators, frankly, sometimes we're so far removed from the edges of the fields, our aims for what we could do with learners is quite dated. And so for one of the things I think is really important is that we all continually, and I tell people I'm reading genetics sometimes and can't read half of it, but I actually think it's quite important that I have some sense of where the edges of the field are for what I imagine we should be doing with kiddos. And I want to highlight this brilliant work by Shell and colleagues who are doing just remarkable work showing empirically how social systems are consequential for environmental outcomes and scientific outcomes in ways that I think is really new, that you can't model environments if you're not also modeling things like residential segregation, resource distribution, right? And things like environmental pollutants, that those interrelations are actually having impacts on things like, in particular, Shell studies coyote evolution, right? So the species development of humans and more than humans are integrated around the way that we study both natural and human environments in ways that we have actually not done well of as kind of scholars and human communities, but it's shifting. So I like to show this work about how remarkable it is that you can do this and that it is the edges of environmental science to be able to really think across these dimensions. So for me, holding on to that Western science development really comes to another really important point that I'm going to end up talking about in learning environments. I spend a lot of time thinking about the remaking of kin relations and Indigenous knowledge systems. And for me, there are really these four kinds of things around the recognition of personhood beyond the human, thinking about our relational construals, something I like to think about as ethical reflection and decolonial responsibility. I think that the trouble for scholars is that we are in colonial institutions that privilege Western knowledge systems. And so all of our incentive systems, all of our routine practices are towards coloniality, are towards extraction and a kind of individualism that I actually think is a really big problem for us. I am deeply excited. If people have not seen this new kinship series that the Center for Humans and Nature put out, and just came out a little while ago, I would really recommend everyone read it. It's gorgeous. And one of the distinctions that I want to talk about, the difference between kin relations and personhood, is really quite important. And they do a nice job of talking about personhood is necessary. Personhood of more than humans is a necessary shift, but it is not the same thing necessarily as recognizing kin relations. And for me, this has been a really important thing for us to recognize that there is an ethic in kin relations that could be missed in just recognizing the personhood of more than humans. However, it's an important move to think about how is it that we engage in relations that are based in a kind of dignity and deference with each other that changes life forms. So I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna pause right after this to see if there's some questions, because I'm not tracking in here, and some clarifications. But I'm hoping or thinking that some of you might be like, okay, but how do we do this really with kids or in learning environments? And the next part of the talk is really going to be focused on why and what I think we could be doing as scholars and educators to generating potential educational tools and models for possible futures. But I'm going to pause for a second. Are there questions that I can take?
Megan, I think people have been listening so carefully that the questions will be coming, but let me just see, somebody just put something in the chat. This work is so powerful. Interested in your thoughts on teaching and learning about global issues with the recognition that knowledge is situated in place and that place-based issues often provide the immediate context for teaching and learning. How do we teach about global issues?
Yeah, I think that is, I love the term. I mean, people have been trying to figure this out, right? Localization and thinking about what that toggling looks like. And here's what I would say. I think that this is actually the challenge for all of us. And I'm going to say some more about that. You're going to see part of the way that I've been trying to design for this very issue. And part of this is, to me, about how we imagine that we're always engaged in a kind of complex systems reasoning. In complexity systems, you toggle across scales as fundamental to forms of reasoning, whether it's at aggregate or agent kinds of levels. And I think that this is the question for us as we're designing learning environments. How is it that we make space for, I've been thinking with musical metaphors too, but what are the rhythms of thinking between the local and the global, and how is it that they interanimate each other for actually more rigor and deeper understandings without us always, I think the biggest problem is when we talk about global issues, they end up erasing localities. And I think that that's partly by the way that we teach about them and the way we design thinking. And what would it look like if there was a rhythm from local to kind of global to local to global in our forms of thought and in our learning environments that we just don't currently do very often. So that would be one thing that I would say. So I also, there's a question here about some of my work on land education. I want to be really clear. I am using different words for different audiences. I am based in doing work on land and water-based education, and I would argue these are actually deeply intertwined. What I am not entirely, all of these ideas are deeply rooted in here. What I am not going to talk about is the indigenous specific forms of this today, in part, and I'll tell you why. Usually when I only talk about indigenous learning environments for audiences like this, the first question is, this is lovely, but what about for everybody else? And part of what I got pushed by my elders is to start figuring out how to put models of field-based or land-based or place-based education in motion in ways that also could transform the coloniality of schools. And even in working with tribal communities that were beholden to some state level or federal level kinds of things, we needed models that could be, sometimes I think they're a little trickster, right? That they could navigate across multiple discourses of what is needed for education. So Carolyn, I hope that as you continue to see this, you recognize that, or that it's obvious. If not, I'd love to hear more from you about what you didn't hear today that made you feel like this is really different than your other work. And Thomas, I see, yeah, you know, a series of Maori scholars have been mentors, and I feel like New Zealand has been a leader in understanding what it looks like to create models of education that are bicultural. And it's actually been really, when 20 years ago or so, I first visited New Zealand, it was a bit of a ray of hope. I am an urban dwelling Native person, multi-generational due to relocation. And for a long time, we had this paradigm that urban Native people were somehow losing our culture and dispossessed. And then when I had my first kid on my homelands, also known as Chicago, it was actually New Zealand folks helped me recognize that I had been working with a colonial view of time and space. That my homelands were still my homelands, even if they were under the political territory, the political rule of somebody else. And that by not being able to see past that temporality, I was actually engaged in a kind of coloniality of thought. And there's lots, you'll see where that has gone. So Sarah, I think there's lots to do about this. I'm gonna keep going because I feel like there's a lot more that I wanna say here. So Joel, I think that's such a really good question. I want to be clear, white human supremacy isn't about white people. It's a paradigm about whiteness, right? It's a view of the human. And what is super interesting, if you actually look at indigenous territories in Asia and some of the political developments in Asia around the recognition of indigenous peoples who are racially Asian, there is a lot happening there, right? So I just want to be clear about this. White human supremacy isn't only about white people. It can be about white people, but it is about a paradigm of whiteness and a view of what a human should be and what humans are not, that is actually underneath around white supremacy. Yeah, so these are other good questions. I'm going to keep going for a minute so we can see. I feel like these are all lovely questions, but I want to get a little bit to the how-to and what does it mean if we're scholars. And I'm assuming that many of you are scholars that are actually doing work with kiddos or with educators trying to really move environmental education in particular ways. And I think what you could probably get from me is that I think we all have to take seriously that all teaching and learning is political and ethical. This is a bit connected to Sarah's question about potentially NGSS straitjackets. And what I would argue here is that designing learning environments, enacting learning environments determines what and whose politics and ethics are worthy of children's life breaths. And so for me, as a scholar, the design of learning environments at every detail is a decision that is political and ethical, because we're making decisions about what students should learn, why they should learn it, how they should learn it, where they should learn it, and who should teach it. Now, you have to remember, the United States has used education as a tool of colonial harm. I often tell people the reason I'm an education scholar is because education has been a tool of genocide in the United States, and I long for the day that it actually contributes to Indigenous thriving. And it means actually a different attunement to what we're up to at every step of the way. And here's what I'll say. I think that I do not think that bifurcated kinds of paradigms help us. So I work deeply with NGSS, but my stance about NGSS is that there's some good things about it, but it's not sufficient. And if it leads, then there's a problem. For me, starting from place allows us to do NGSS and way more. And usually what happens is because we have an economy of poverty with learning time that dictates how it is and what we can do in a day, that we reduce complexity with kiddos and with learning environments rather than imagine it in an expanse of possibilities. And I need to say this because one of the biggest problems for me is that we have discourses of pragmatics that drive our imaginations. And what that has meant, and part, is a settler colonial investment in systemic erasure of Indigenous peoples, right? We can see lots and lots of work, but over time, we can see that standards, 87% of US educational standards dictate the teaching of Indigenous peoples in the context of pre-1900. And only half of our states actually have a standard to teach about Indigenous peoples at all. So part of the point here is that if we don't recognize standards as also a political and ethical assertion of what should be learned, and we take them up as the ground from which we act, we're in trouble. And so for me, there's always actually, I'm not going to, I'll get there and I'll help teachers know how they can do this and do the things that they're required to do, but I'm not using it as the start. And this is not unlike my point about being able to see Chicago as always my homelands, even if temporally right now, there's a particular political configuration. So recognizing some time, I want to get through some things. So I think that one of the biggest things that we really have to work on is dismantling economic logics of purpose towards cultivating the conditions for kinning. Love this idea of kinning, which is the idea of how are we continually making kin relations. And here's what I'll say. Right now, we have an education system that motivates purpose and value by what kinds of jobs and potential economic security kids will have if they do X, Y, and Z. And I think it's a problem. And it's not that I'm suggesting we can't worry about economy. All societies have had economic systems. But childhood is not driven, or shouldn't be driven in my mind, by a motivating factor of economics. And I really think that we need to keep thinking about that. We start talking about jobs and careers to kids very early in their development. As a former Head Start teacher, I had my little area where we talked about occupations, and you could dress up as a fireman, or you could dress up as a policeman, or you could dress up as a vet, right? We insert future human life in models of economics, not kin. And I think it's one of the fundamental things we need to do. And I think that means that we need new models of education that have different origins or different ontologies of purpose. And I just want to say, as we're talking about this, Sylvia Wynter's work on studying the reproductions of the same harms, even when intended, when other intentions were in motion, is brilliant and really helpful to recognize that people's reproductions of inequitable systems isn't always on intent. It has a view of actually a misunderstanding of the levers of change or the root causes of problems that drives a theory of change. And for me, there's a deep one at play that I feel some need to say today. While I am encouraged by the expansion of engagement and visibility of Indigenous communities, I am also deeply worried that there are new forms of reproductions of erasure, invisibility, and extraction at play at the same time. And I'll say some more about that, but my biggest concern is people want all of our brilliance and none of our persons. And so there's deep engagement or desired engagement with the novelties of non-Indigenous peoples with Indigenous knowledge systems, but none of the political or ethical responsibility to being in relations. So, I love the idea here that Cite Your Grandma, Lee Patel's work, where part of the challenge for us as scholars is that we're taught we have to do citations trails based in the academic of Western knowledge systems. So it creates all these problems. And for those of us who most of our deepest knowledge comes from our grandma or great grandma or grandpa, it poses this problem because we start citing somebody outside of us as a way to legitimize our deepest ideas. So I think this is a really big problem that I encourage everyone to be very cautious of. But I want to recognize, I really want to get to a little bit of like, okay, these are big ideas, how do you do this? And I want to share a little bit with my project that Dilafruz started with my dear co-PIs, Carrie Zoe, Mary Margaret Welch, and Sharon Seals, that we've been up to for a while. And this project is a 4-year participatory design research project in Seattle, and it's expanding to multiple states with partners that I'm really excited about. And I would just say this is an NGSS aligned. It's not an NGSS driven, but it's an aligned model, I would argue. And what we really did is we developed a new model. Everything that I'm going to show you was not in place at the beginning of this project. We co-designed it with teachers, with school district leaders, community-based organizations, scholars, and families and kiddos over the last 4.5 years. And I'm going to try to show you a little bit about some of these models. I do just want to say that participatory design research is a particular methodology for designing research. And it is a little bit different than participatory action research, I would argue, in part because we are deeply accountable to moving learning theory along and not just reaching some outcomes. Now, there's lots. I come from a learning sciences background, so I was trained in a particular way. So don't get hung up on that part, but I would say that. And if for people who are interested, what did that really mean? We engaged in seasonal co-design summits for years, where we came together for 3 to 5 days, engaged in place-based inquiries, designed learning, and then tried them, and then came back together, and then tried them, and came back together. It is extraordinarily time intensive, to be quite frank, in order to co-design. And we're now in the process of trying to understand, okay, can you get people into these new models of education that is not quite so time intensive? But what I'm going to share with you today is actually what we built and some of these material tools. And I'm interested in material tool development because I think they're mediational tools to potential futures. And right now, I would argue that capitalist tool production drives what's in classrooms. And I think that it is one of those things that we don't do enough with to transform. And so we built this learning environment, this ecology, we call it the Learning in Places ecosystem, where at the heart was this rhizome, which is really the core conceptual ideas. We developed all these what we call educator frameworks around these big ideas so you could dig in. And then we have these two things. One is a storyline, which many of you may know. This is deeply aligned with NGSS and the idea of moving beyond sort of singular lessons or lessons that are kind of short and truncated to longer inquiries driven by different kinds of practices. And then what we call learning engagements, which are bundled sets of lesson plans aligned with the storyline. What I'm going to do today is try to show you how we operationalize some of these big ideas that I was just talking about. And the first is really our rhizome. This is what we call our rhizome. And the idea is, can we learn how to propagate these core ideas into learning environments in ways that transform them. And I want to call attention to these big ideas about intercultural relations and power and historicity set the ground for all of these other dimensions. And we really have organized it around three. One is complex socio-ecological systems, and you don't need to make sense of all the specifics here. Culture, families, and communities, and then field-based science learning. And what I want to name here is, even though I'm telling you about field-based science learning, if you don't do it in relation to all these other things, I think we'll probably reproduce the problems. Our frameworks are huge. You can, by the way, everyone get these all online. All of this is free. People can download them and use them as much as they'd like. But we've been really deliberate about recognizing that teachers asked us that we would get into these ideas and they'd be like, these are amazing. I need tools to help me remember in interactional moments with kids, because this is a paradigm shift that is really hard for one person to do on their own. And these frameworks became a way to do that. So I'm just going to say that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our frameworks. So they really helped educators with new languages and new concepts for ways of thinking. And they helped scaffold different kinds of important dimensions, whether they were design, examples of student thinking, classroom vignettes, and even educator reflections. And these frameworks are all interconnected. So it wasn't like singular pieces. They actually built and spoke to each other. We also did this all multilingually. So that's the other thing to say. I'm not going to say tons about that today. And here's what I want to kind of say today. Here's an example. This is our histories of place. And part of what we were after is, how do you help educators not continue to only educate in nation state time? And what we needed in environmental education, which I would call colonial time, is that we needed many non-Indigenous educators needed help holding these different dimensions and recognizing the different spatial and temporal scales that were relevant to kids' thinking and kids' questions. But we also wanted them to recognize they were engaged in a kind of education that didn't invite learners into dreaming social futures and positioning their learners as consequential actors or makers of future worlds. So for us, this living ethical futures and possibilities really became an important thing for educators to realize as a kind of discursive, regular discursive mood in their classroom discourse to elevate. I'm going to show you a couple of others. This is really just to show you that the earlier power and historicity one really comes into motion, even when we get into some of the deeper kinds of content learning that needed to happen. So we have all these sort of deep relationships and terms that are used in ecological sciences like symbiosis and synchrony, as well as making visible all the kinds of social relationships that are often studied in civics or in social studies. And we brought those two together and recognized that power and historicity is always mediating those relationships. This is also probably one of my most favorite is, and this is connected to these should we questions, is that we realized that if we wanted kiddos to engage, learners to engage in ethical deliberation and decision making, we needed frameworks. Teachers wanted frameworks. They felt really uncomfortable about doing that. It felt political to them in a way that they had come to feel like they weren't supposed to do. And we really wanted people to figure out, how do you do that and still always ask, what data and evidence is informing your thinking? How is this grounded in a kind of scientific inquiry? So you also don't need to make sense of this all, but I just wanted to demonstrate all of these frameworks got developed to help educators implement and kind of hold the complexity that we're talking about. And I want to say we did this with PK2. So everything that I'm talking about in this model was done with preschoolers up to second grade, and we're now expanding up to fifth graders. But my point about this is kindergartners, first graders, second graders can do all of this. And we have it all on video if you doubt me. But I want to pull about why this ethical deliberation and decision making, and then I recognize I need to stop. So I'm almost there. Wondering has become this really important piece for us, that we often don't afford children the space for wondering and awe. I would argue environmental and outdoor place-based educators probably argue for this more than anyone else in the educational landscape. And I think one of our challenges is how do we show how to move from awe to other forms of engagement and inquiry. And we've been working on this. What our teachers loved watching children be animated by wondering and awe outdoors, but then had real struggle about moving into investigations. And so we've been working on this again around how is it that we develop these models. And I would just argue that part of us, and this is kind of our storyline, and I just want you to attend to these pink parts, is that we had to move from should we questions into investigations, which is in that middle part, in order to help people understand a structure of learning. Now, you also don't need to make sense of all this, but what I wanted you to see is that this is our model, our storyline model, that educators asked for. They needed visual heuristics to hold what they were up to, so that over their course of inquiry, they could hold the complexity they were after. And so sometimes I don't think we provide these kind of visual tools for educators to hold when we're asking for paradigm shifts. So in the course of this, there's lots more to say about this. Hopefully I've intrigued you a little bit. Usually someone is like, okay, but do you have any evidence this is actually transforming those kind of core nature culture relations and reasoning patterns? And I'm not going to do this, but I'll do it at the end. I just want to highlight one of my, she is a professor at Western Washington now, Charlene Nolan, whose dissertation studied family tools in this activity, where she studied, we have a set of family tools where kiddos and their families were doing different activities connected to the classroom inquiries. Some of those tools are what we call indoor discourse-based activities. They were asked that kids had to have conversations with their families. And some of them were outdoor or mobile discourse and observational mobile activities. She studied the differences in human reasoning and the kinds of components of reasoning for us. This is a kind of foundational way to study children's conceptual relationships in ecosystems. It's based in ecosystems cognition. And she analyzed these for the different construals of relations. And I want to point this out. Here are her findings. On the left are the family discussion tools. The red that you see here are all human relationships with something else. What we might say is it might still have been great, but this is deeply anthropocentric reasoning in these family discussion-based tools. On the right, with the purples and blues, are relationships beyond the human. And part of what we want to attend to, same families, different activity structure once you're outside, that changes the very nature at the micro-interactional, attentional space and discursive space to something that is much broader than anthropocentrism. For us, this is profoundly important evidence that actually the move to outside affords a difference in human activity, that continuing to only talk about it rather than enact it in outdoor places is going to continue to be a problem. So what I want to end with, and hopefully take a few more questions, there are lots of other cool findings, and this is my shameless plug for other students who are talking about this. There's another session later on led by where Nikki Magdad and Jordan Sherry Wagner are participating and talking about both of these projects in more depth. So I hope you'll do that. And I hope that as you continue to think about this you really continue to consider what is our responsibility, our collective responsibility, given the challenges of our times. And I will stop there and see if there are questions. Oh,
there's one, it's from Joseph. You mentioned in passing the limits of policy, wondering if you can say more about this, especially given your relationships with both Spencer and the federal government.
Yeah, it's interesting you're equating those two right now, Joe. You know, I think one of the things that I have learned is that I don't know that all harm is intended. And the more that I am in particular places, I actually recognize it's actually a failure of heterogeneity at decision-making tables, at imagining tables, that is leading to some of the reproduction. And so for me, I never think policy is never the lead. It never has been in human change. Policy, right? Like policy has been the lead in human oppression. But human important change has come from grounded movements. And so, but I also think that if we're really students of social change, we recognize that there are always multiple roles to play. And that when people are pushing for kind of communal level change, activism, in our histories, they were also people engaged in policy making that was connected to those things. I spent time in South Africa right after apartheid ended and before the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions happened. So as a young person, I was deeply influenced by a view of multiple decades of efforts of change that also saw beyond this one outcome. The other thing I'll just say about this is Linda Smith gave a talk about 8 years ago, and she asked me, or we were in a conversation, and she asked this question to the audience, and since then I've spent a lot of time with her. What happens the day after revolution or the day after decolonization? And it reveals a way that we sometimes think about change as points in time rather than ongoing processes. So I think policy, we have to keep pushing policy to be as progressive as possible. But if we keep waiting, I think we're in trouble. I'm looking at other questions. Yeah, Ellen asked a great question about Anthropocene and its human supremacy. It's part of why I was pointing my worry about how Indigenous erasure is playing out again. I am worried about the Anthropocene language, and I actually think there's some real questions with things like, although I love it and I read it all the time and I learn from it, I don't know that new materialisms or some of the bigger change, some of the really theoretical groundbreaking things in the academy right now are quite aware of their Western centrisms and how those Western centrisms can continue to play out a kind of Western knowledge systems. And it's usually because someone will often, you know, Linda is also, so we're not in a post-colonial world. Right, and there's a way in which actually the demand for us to make ourselves visible, depend upon Western systems, plays out, and I think it's all over the Anthropocene too. We continue to look for a kind of human technocratic solution to climate change problems that is just not going to do it. But I think we're almost at time, so thank you all.
Thank you, Megan. Really, what can one say at the end of this? Thank you so much. I think we take away these really powerful concepts that you have encouraged us to think about: kinning, kin relationship, wonderment. I love that word. Imagine action and futures. Recognize complex systems. Beyond bifurcating thinking. Co-design participatory research. Zones, and how do you multiply what you're doing, and what are ethical deliberations in terms of what we do, and on and on and on. I mean, this has been so phenomenal in terms of encouraging us to really come to the heart of why we do research and how we can bring about changes and how to question our cultural assumptions, as I said in the beginning. So thank you so much for your wisdom and for sharing this time with us. I appreciate it. Okay, just a few housekeeping matters. What's coming up next? We have 4 concurrent sessions starting at 1:15 in about 15 minutes, and then at 2:15, 3:15, and 4:15. There are lots of amazing papers, roundtables, and so on. And then you can also access the poster sessions. This continues, and the reminder is that the poster sessions are actually completed research projects. And then we have a closing plenary at 5:45, and that is on opportunities and challenges in climate change education with a stellar group of research scholars. And we hope you will all join us at that time too, as we then move on to our next week and talk about that a little bit. But make the most of this time, all of you. We have a record number of people joining us this year, and that's over 380 for the research symposium. It's way beyond what we've had in the last 2 years, and that is so phenomenal. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Megan. This has been precious.